This then leads to a real problem of coercion. There can obviously be very overt examples of coercion. As I mentioned before, drugs like modafinil are reportedly being used by the US Army during combat situations. And I find it pretty hard to imagine that these soldiers are given much of a choice in the matter. Even now, I've just put my daughter into childcare, and I had to show evidence that she'd had all the vaccinations before she was allowed to start. What if all young medical students were required to prove that they had taken their dose of modafinil every night before starting a night shift? This is obviously a little bit ridiculous, but it's not outside the realms of possibility. But a more likely scenario is that the coercion will be much more implicit. Nobody would force you to take the pills, but if you're a young student or a young professional, you will know that you have to take them if you want to be successful, because everybody else is taking them. One big problem associated with this sort of intellectual arms race is not so much preventing people from getting smarter and smarter. The problem that educators in the US are starting to get very worried about is that these drugs, and drugs like Ritalin for ADHD, they cost money. And at the moment, the use of enhancement drugs is really increasing the class divide between the rich and the poor. So in the past, the richer students could afford to hire tutors and had better access to educational resources. And now they can also afford drugs that will help them remember more than the poorer students. This is definitely already happening in the US, with the highest use of these sorts of drugs being reported in the most expensive and exclusive colleges. Now, whenever we think about drugs in this context, one reason people often have a very strong reaction is because they are scared of the potential dangers. There seems to be a commonly held belief that the more fun a drug is, or the more benefit you seem to get, the more dangerous it must be. What I find fascinating is the prospect that drugs someday in the future will likely be developed that don't have any negative side effects. There is actually evidence coming out at the moment that antidepressant drugs like Prozac might actually be neuroprotective. They may actually help to build stronger, more healthy brains. So I think it's a very real possibility, and something we need to think about, that there may be a future that we have drugs that help us to sleep less, feel better, remember more, and they'll also actually be good for our brain and will help us live longer. So the question is, are we going to ban these drugs, or are we going to draw up legislation to ensure that it is a right of every citizen in the country to have free access to them if they can't afford to buy them themselves? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do think they are questions that society is going to have to face eventually. The next two drugs I want to mention are far more experimental, and I'll just only describe them very briefly. One of the most amazing experiments that I ever heard about was first reported by a group of Swiss neuroscientists in 2005. What these scientists did was they used a naturally occurring hormone. I think this is also important. People often think that if it's artificial, it's bad, but if it's natural, it's okay. So they used a naturally occurring hormone called oxytocin to increase people's trust. Oxytocin is known to be released during childbirth and breastfeeding to help increase the bond between mother and child. These researchers got random strangers and put them into pairs and asked them to play an economic trust game. So they gave one person money, and the basic rule of the game was that to make the most amount of money, you would have to trust your partner enough to hand over all of your money, because it was only money that's handed over. Whenever money was handed over, it would get automatically tripled. So then it was up to the partner to actually then have to repay the money that was entrusted to them. The most amazing thing is that in this game, the people gave significantly more money to their partner, who was a complete stranger, after they had oxytocin sprayed up their nose. And the reason they did this was they reported having more trust in their partners than they did without the oxytocin. Now, the most frightening thing with all of this is the fact that it was a nasal spray. I don't want to be alarmist. I'm sure car salesmen aren't going to start releasing this stuff through the air conditioning vents. But there is currently work being done to try to use drugs like oxytocin in a clinical setting to increase trust between patients and therapists. And I can certainly imagine a day where couples might go to some sort of counselling and take a dose of oxytocin just because they feel that their relationship is breaking down and in need of a boost of their trust levels. The ethical implications associated with the use of a drug to artificially enhance trust are obviously huge, and the potential dangers associated with the possible exploitation of this is absolutely terrifying. So I'll leave you to ponder these things, and in the interest of time I'll move quickly to the final section. So to finish off, I want to talk about some recent discoveries that suggest it might one day be possible to erase a traumatic memory and reprogram our brain. I think this is an incredibly exciting breakthrough, as it could really help a lot of people. Basically, what researchers found is that when you remember emotional events, there are two components of that memory. One component is just the factual information about when, where and what actually happened. The second component is the feeling associated with the experience. So a good example is the attack on the World Trade Center in September 11. I think everyone that saw the events unfold on TV would remember many of the horrible details. And many of us might be reminded of these events every time they see a plane flying too low, or if they see some strange man walking with a big backpack or something like that. The problem is that some people are not simply reminded of the events, but they become overwhelmed by the terror, and they re-experience all of the paralysing fear that they had experienced at the time, and they have the complete sort of physiological responses as well. Now, this is what people call post-traumatic stress disorder, and it can be incredibly debilitating. Last year, some researchers in the Netherlands showed that it might be possible to erase the emotional, paralysing content of memory without altering any of the factual content of the memory. These researchers gave people electric shocks at the same time that they presented scary images of spiders. After a few trials, people came to expect a shock when they saw the spiders, and their body would have a physical anxiety response to the images even after the shock stopped being applied. Then they brought people back a second day and they presented the images again. But this time it was after people had been given a drug called propranolol, which blocks the body's emotional anxiety type of responses. And what they found is that they were able to sort of retrain the body and the mind to associate these images to the blocked and the dulled emotional response. And so the drug would sort of really block all of the arousing experiences, and the mind would remember to associate that with these images. Now, the study used college students and images of spiders, but there are already other studies being run looking at the use of this drug during therapy. The idea being that if you could get people to remember back to a traumatic experience while they were taking propranolol, they would start to associate those memories with this dull emotional state, rather than the highly arousing, terrifying, anxious emotions that they had originally associated with the experience. This could obviously have huge impact on people with post-traumatic stress disorder and other victims of trauma. Some people have asked me whether this drug could be used for evil, where people could do horrible things and simply take a pill so they forget what they did. I personally don't think that's too likely. I think the science suggests that people will still be able to remember, they just won't experience the paralysing feel every time they remember it. But I guess it's still a sort of open question of whether you'll be able to erase components of guilt, for example, if you did something unjust to somebody else. So, just to summarise, in the future, there will be drugs around that will allow us to sleep less, remember more of the stuff we want to remember, and to be able to erase memories we prefer to forget. And if we are struggling to connect with our friends and partners, there will also be drugs that can help us trust more and feel closer to those around us. I've tried to be as unbiased as possible. I'm not trying to say all future discoveries will be good, but I'm also not saying they'll be bad. I'm just giving you a heads up. These are important issues that need to be considered by society. Regulating these drugs or not regulating these drugs could have a huge impact on the way we live our lives in the future. In the US and Europe, advisory committees of philosophers and neuroscience scientists and policymakers have been established to think about these issues and attempt to plan for policy changes that will help balance the potential good of these drugs with all the issues that might cause major problems for individuals and society. As far as I know, there have been some discussions about setting up something similar in Australia, but nothing concrete has happened yet. But that's just, I could be wrong. There may be some government think tanks already considering these issues. Either way, I think the future will continue to throw up a number of interesting questions that we will have to face as a society. I think, if nothing else, it should be a very interesting time. And thanks, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Rob Moody, who is Chair of Global Health at the Nossal Institute for Global Health here in Melbourne. He has 30 years' experience in planning and evaluating health programs in Australia and Africa, Asia and the Pacific. He was also the Chair of the National Preventative Health Task Force and was previously the CEO of Vic Health. He's also an enthusiastic cook and the co-author of a cookbook, which is also related to health, with Gabriel Gattei, or a book about food and health. And he's going to speak to us about balance, health and embracing the arts. Rob Moody.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you for the opportunity of being here. Actually, I'm a lousy cook. That's why I put together a book with someone who actually does know how to cook, Gabriel Gattei. But coming back to sort of tonight's issue around what's changing in our world, how can we cope with this? Well, I guess I just wanted to read you some findings from a recent some work done by the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. Just asking about the social context of what's happening in our society. I'd asked a pretty big sample, and what people came back and they said, well, look, we see our world as being increasingly competitive. We've got increased wealth, but it's an increased focus on materialism. We've got great changing information, telecommunications technologies. We have increased expectations to be successful. We have faster and more complex lives associated with increased distress levels. We have increased housing costs, increased individualism. We see a lack of social cohesion, some breaking of the extended family ties, a greater influence from marketing and the media, and less opportunity to be active. So it's a pretty interesting way of putting the positives are there. Certainly the positives are around increased access to opportunities, to information, to material comforts. But some of the negatives that people described included the expectation, often unrealistic, that your worth as an individual is tied up with your ability to achieve all these things, as well as the time pressures that were mentioned before, be they the pressures of time, emotional, physical and financial. Now, one of the interesting things that was also asked in this was, well, look, how does life compare now to 20 years ago? And 80% of people said, well, our material standard of living is higher than it was 20 years ago. When asked about our emotional health, 16% said we're better off than we were 20 years ago, and 60% said we're worse off than we were 20 years ago about our emotional health. So we're getting richer materially, but we seem to be, this is what we are saying, we're getting less rich emotionally. So these are just some of the what is changing in our world. How do we cope with it? Do we take a pill? Maybe we do. Normally, in my day job, being interested in public health and population health, then I'll take that view. In fact, have been accused of being in the health police. Live miserably so you die healthily. Or, even if you do everything that we tell you to do, and you don't do everything we tell you not to do, even if your life isn't longer, it'll seem longer. And that's where, I'm sometimes accused of coming from. So tonight I'll leave aside the population side and just look at us as individuals, which is really where sort of this work that I'd done with Gabriel Gattei had come from, and we'd put together these recipes. I'm interested in recipes about not the food, because I know nothing about food, but recipes about our life in different parts of our lives. So our physical lives, our social lives, our cultural lives, our intellectual lives, our work lives, and our emotional and spiritual lives. Now, they're not all in boxes, but they're different aspects to our lives, I think, anyway. And just imagine if you had, 6 jars, right? And you're given these 6 jars, and they each represent different parts of your life, your intellectual, social, cultural work, so on. And you've got I've given you some jelly beans, right? And the jelly beans represent the amount of money you have, the amount of time you have, the effort, resources you have. How do you distribute those jelly beans now in terms of your social life, your social relationships, your emotional and spiritual life, your physical life, your work life? Now, I know how I maldistribute mine, and, more go into particularly the work jar than would otherwise be sensible. It's a bit like coming back to Richard's point about, where's the common sense in all this. But just it's worth thinking about where do we actually distribute our effort and our time, our resources in managing our own lives. And the question, I think, is that the issue is that we often do fall out of balance. And I don't have the randomised controlled trial to tell you about the value of balance, but I think there is something in there about how we can balance these different parts of our lives successfully. And to do that, I think, we do have to make some effort, put time and effort into these different parts of our lives, because they do return us good. I think there is good return on investment. If you took our physical lives, for example, and recently I had to write a chapter for the Bike Bible, for the Bike Victoria, and so they asked me to do something about physical activity. And if there was one magic bullet in all of these things, then it might be physical activity. Our bodies are somehow built to move. I just don't think we're ever going to get the pill to make us move. Now, I could be wrong, but maybe you take a pill and you sort of move and you don't have to. But you don't have to do anything yourself. But somehow, we are built as sort of machines, and to make it work, we've got to move it. And unfortunately, there's been this, in a sense, conspiracy of sedentariness over the last 30 years. It's actually harder to be physically active. Transport, we've become very enamoured with the car, as Richard was pointing out. Labour-saving devices. We have a washing machine now. We don't have the copper. Not that I ever did it, or would do it now, because Anne, my wife, is here, and she will tell you the truth about how lousy I am at home. But the point about this is, we don't want to bring back those sort of labour-using devices, because there's a huge amount of convenience in them. But there are other ways, and Richard was talking a little bit about this, about how we can bring activity back into our lives. And obviously we've lost some of the incidental activity that's been designed out. We go to big buildings and try and walk up the stairs. Well, we've designed them out, because you can get down the stairs, but you probably can't get up them. In terms of incidental activity, walk to work, or who's a jogger here, by the way? Who jogs? You live 3 years longer than non-joggers. Of course, the problem is you spend those 3 years jogging. Anyway, there are multiple factors that work here, and in fact, incidental activity, transport, respect for the environment, and all goes together. The more people we can get walking, cycling, public transport to work, the fitter they are, the less congested our roads are, and the better for the environment. So there are some things where we can actually, it doesn't mean we can do away with the car, like my car, but it's how do we modify that so that we get the maximum number of people who actually do want to walk and can cycle or can use public transport. So there's some rearranging to do that we can do as a society, but also as individuals. The more that you can trade in your travel time for active travel time, you actually do, in a sense, save time. You don't have to go and stand on the or run on the treadmill and watch CNN at the same time. Our emotional and spiritual lives, and we've just seen the data on this, that somehow we seem to be thinking that we're losing this. Now, I think in some ways I'm not terribly surprised, because it hasn't necessarily entered into our culture as it has, say, with physical activity, 30 minutes a day. It's sort of, we know we need to do that, even if we're not doing it. About our emotional and spiritual lives, is it anywhere in our consciousness or in our culture that somehow we need to spend 30 minutes a day investing in our emotional health or development or our spiritual development? I don't necessarily think it's there. And I just can't see how we can grow emotionally and cope without some form of investment into our own emotional and spiritual health. Now, that may be yoga, it may be prayer, it may be meditation, it may be finding your own special place, it may be walking the dog. Doesn't matter. I think it's up to us to find out that that way of looking after ourselves, of nurturing our own emotions and our own spirits. But it seems to me that somehow we need to be selfish to be generous. Most of us are caring for other people in some way or other. We might be teaching, we might be in the health field, we might be looking after our parents, we might be looking after our kids. And I'm absolutely convinced, again without the randomised controlled trial, that to do that well, to care for others, we need to care for ourselves first. We do a better job when we're emotionally healthy and stable, then our relationships are stronger, which does bring me on to the next issue of our social relationships. And, at the moment, it's how do we manage? We actually have increased access to each other through e-technology. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes the technology controls us rather than us necessarily controlling the technology. And maybe, I hope not, but maybe, we'll be, and our kids will get better at e-hugs, but they won't be so good at real hugs. And that's the question, how do we physically hug each other as well as e-hug? The next area is I think it's very, we had Astrid tonight, where our cultural expression comes out, our cultural lives, our artistic lives. And there's there is actually good evidence around, if you sing, your immunoglobulin levels rise. And even if you listen, it's probably gone up. So please thank Astrid for improving our immunoglobulin levels tonight on her behalf. But sing in a choir, and you know how good that feels. Well, the Swedes have done wonderful long-term studies looking at this, and singing in a choir does make you live longer. I don't know if it lives better because you spend those time, in a choir, but it's not actually a bad place to be. It's probably better being in a choir than jogging. But nevertheless, our capacity to express ourselves, it's often because we're doing it with other people. It is really enhanced. It does enhance our health. There's actually good evidence, and the evidence will grow, I'm sure, around the value of artistic expression, particularly in where you're doing it with others, with whether it's kids doing circus or drama or music, or it doesn't matter. I mean, it's a question. You can see it in people's eyes and faces and in their smiles. Our intellectual development. Well, we've heard the easy way. There's a slightly harder way. Is how do we keep our brain? The brains going. Look at the work from coming out of the sort of Alzheimer's researchers, and they're really telling us it is about very simple stuff about don't smoke, exercise, eat pretty sensibly, sleep well. Some very basic lessons about how we can prevent the onset of dementia. Again, it won't protect everybody, but it will, at a population level, it certainly will protect us. And I've certainly found that my own experience of recently I've been working in Mozambique and teaching, and one of the things I've been doing there is teaching in the evening and trying to learn Portuguese in the morning. And I realise how hard this is, but it literally makes some of my grey hair go black. How the struggle, and I must admit it's all gone. I'll have one of the memory drugs to keep it all there because it's gone from each time I go back, it's all gone straight out the door. But the issue of challenging our brains constantly, whether it's Sudoku or crosswords, or it's a bit like the physical stuff. Use it or lose it. And I'm sure there's some real common sense in there about constantly using our brains. The last area is in our work lives. This is very important. The better that we, in a sense, adapt to our work lives, keep it in balance with what else we're doing, and this is, again, I'm an absolute work in progress, do as I say rather than as I do. But we seek identity, we seek relationships, we seek remuneration, we seek our place in the world, often through work. But it has to, I think, be in balance. So that's the other thing was about time, and Richard mentioned this before. We are, and it comes back all the time. So, don't try and do everything at once. That's a good idea, but I've never got time for this. Well, it is actually worth looking at how you do spend time. the average Australian spends about 21 hours a week watching television. So just take, if you're the average Australian, you may not be, take an hour away a day. You've got quite a bit of extra time. We waste, I think, an enormous amount of time worrying. I do anyway. Worrying about the trivial, the unfixable, and a sense of our emotional life. I don't know, if my emotional life was better in fixed up, I'd actually be much more efficient. The travel issue, time on the web. There are, I think, places that we can seek in our day to actually investing that in, I think, areas around our emotional health and maybe our physical health. Thanks very much.